Hello, I'm John Shavacco, the co-chair of the NY-GEO 2023 conference and a board member of the New York Geothermal Energy Organization. I'd like to welcome you to this recording of a live presentation from the conference, a two-day event which was held in Albany, New York on April 26th and 27th of 2023. This year's educational sessions and keynotes represent the latest in ground source heat pump system design, product innovations, and installation practices, along with important policy, regulatory, financing, and incentive updates. This presentation is one of over 40 sessions from the two-day event, all of which were recorded and available at NY-GEO's website, www.ny-geo.org, along with session descriptions and a link to download the slides from each of the sessions presented. NY-GEO is proud to make this content available to our members and other industry stakeholders, and if you are a member, thanks so much for your support and participation. If you find this content valuable and for some odd reason you are not yet a member, consider joining NY-GEO at the appropriate membership level with details available at our website. The live recording from the NY-GEO 2023 conference will start in just a moment. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming to this panel. Thank you for coming to this amazing conference. Hope everyone had a good lunch. I'm Jessica Azulay. I'm Executive Director of Alliance for a Green Economy, and hopefully you're in the right place. This is the panel on who will pay for building electrification. So we have some great panelists here, but I'm just gonna set the stage a little bit very quickly, especially for anybody who isn't working in the policy space in New York. So just a quick little orientation. We have a climate law here that requires us basically to get off fossil fuels by 2050. And the plan for implementing that climate law calls for 1 to 2 million homes to be electrified by 2030. And our governor has set a goal of 2 million climate-friendly homes by 2030. And by climate-friendly, that's electrified or electrification ready. We basically have to electrify nearly all of our homes by 2050. And we have hundreds of millions of dollars allocated for utility and NYSERDA incentives already for heat pumps and energy efficiency, and we have a state geothermal tax credit, and then we have the IRA set to bring in billions more. So we have a lot already sort of in place that you're going to hear about in this panel. But we have some big challenges because New York has some very old building stock. A lot of these older houses are in dire need of repairs, upgrades, weatherization, and electrical work before they can electrify. So you'll be hearing about some work being done on that, some of the challenges, some work to overcome those challenges, and some proposals to overcome those challenges. And we also pay billions of dollars every year on our gas bills to heat our homes and to make hot water and cook our food. And so as part of this panel, since it was kind of posed to us who will pay for building electrification, I thought it was really important that we also ask who will pay for the gas system. And what does that cost? And are there ways for us to move money that we're currently paying in the gas system toward this huge project of building electrification? So you'll be hearing a lot about what the gas system costs, as well as some ideas for how to move that money. And one final note is that all of these issues are in active debate right now in the New York State legislative session. And so some of our panelists will be talking about some of the proposals in play here, right here in the state legislature. So our panel participants are Michael Hernandez. He's the New York Policy Director of ReWiring America. Annie Carforo, Climate Justice Campaign Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice. Lisa Dix, New York Director of Building Decarbonization Coalition. And Audrey Schulman, Co-founder and Executive Director of Home Energy Efficiency Team, or HEET. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael, who's going to go first.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jessica. As Jessica mentioned, I'm Michael Hernandez, New York Policy Director for ReWiring America, and I'm really happy to be here today. As you may know, ReWiring America was founded in 2020 with one simple idea: electrify everything. Its founders included a consultant to the Department of Energy who mapped out our entire energy ecosystem: the supply side, the coal plants, nuclear, hydropower, solar, and wind, and all the machines we use on the demand side of the equation. ReWiring America, excuse me. And so through that process, we were able to determine what's on the supply side and what's on the demand side. In New York, 32% of our emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, come from our buildings, the largest source of emissions in the state. Nationally, 42% of our energy-related emissions come from decisions that are made around the kitchen table. So the great news is that the Inflation Reduction Act will really help jumpstart the movement towards electrification. The IRA provides rebates, tax credits, grants, and low-cost financing for financial appliances, while at the same time offering powerful incentives on the supply side for renewable sources. We have $858 billion in electric potential to leverage if we make the most of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. So let's talk about electrification incentives for consumers. ReWiring America launched the IRA Savings Calculator last year to show everyday Americans how they can use the Inflation Reduction Act to go electric. Just put in your income, your household size, and some additional information, and you'll get personalized info on how much free money you can get towards your electrification journey. When it comes to financial incentives for consumers under the IRA, they mainly fall under one or two categories. Those are credits and rebates. The tax credits are likely going to be accessible to homeowners with higher incomes, which should be encouraging for business because it may mean larger margins. Rebates, which will provide point-of-sale discounts on appliances and upgrades, will benefit low-income and middle-income Americans the most. The clean energy credit can also include a 30% uncapped tax credit for an electrical panel upgrade, but only if it's installed in conjunction with rooftop solar. Electrification rebates, the rebate cap depends on the project. So you can have $8,000 for a heat pump, $1,700 for a heat pump water heater, $840 for heat pump clothes dryers, $840 for electric or induction stoves, $4,000 for electric panel upgrades, $2,500 for rewiring, and $1,600 for basic weatherization. And so what are the other electrification incentives? We also have state-based home energy efficiency contractor training grants. Those are $200 million for training and education to contractors involved in energy efficiency and electrification upgrades, including through IRA rebate programs. Contractor incentives include electrification rebates, $500 per project, and efficiency rebates, $200 for projects in disadvantaged communities. There's also prevailing wage incentives. The full value of the following tax credits is tied to prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So the Inflation Reduction Act also created the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Act, which provides low-interest loans for qualifying projects that retool, repower, and repurpose or replace energy infrastructure that has ceased operations, or to enable operating energy infrastructure to avoid or reduce emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. Projects that remediate environmental damage associated with energy infrastructure also qualify. So there's also, in addition to IRA, there's state and utility electrification incentives available as well. So beyond the IRA, New York State and local utility companies also offer electrification incentives. And so you can reach out to your local utility to find out about available electrification and energy efficiency incentives. So that's the end of this, and I'll pass it off.
Thank you so much, Michael. So as you just heard, there's a lot of money in New York already and a lot of money coming, but we still have some big barriers to get over, especially for our most vulnerable New Yorkers living in some of the oldest housing. So we're going to hear from Annie from WeAct next to talk about a project that they've done, really looking at what it takes to actually electrify low-income homes.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Annie. I'm from WeAct. So we are a community-based organization that was founded about 35 years ago, is a community organizing against the disproportionate siting of polluting facilities in a historically Black neighborhood known as Harlem up in northern Manhattan. And we've evolved as an organization since then. We now do city, state, and federal advocacy. We do participatory research. We continue to organize locally in our neighborhoods, but our mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that low-income households and communities of color are participating in the creation of sound environmental health policies and practices. And so when we are thinking about this conversation around building decarbonization, from WeAct, we are actually thinking about this as how are we going to decarbonize in environmental justice communities that are primarily low-income families and primarily multifamily buildings made up of renters. So it's a pretty challenging population when we think about building decarb. And there's also a lot of benefits here because residents in these buildings have the most to gain from decarbonization and electrification. Many neighborhoods that are considered environmental justice communities have, higher rates of outdoor air pollution, and that's compounded by exposures to environmental hazards inside, whether that's mold, lead, pests, older appliances, poor ventilation, et cetera. And so in 2021, WeAct launched the Out of Gas in with Justice pilot, which was attempted to study the feasibility of electrification in low-income housing, while also measuring the impacts of air quality when we're switching over to electric appliances. This was the first study of its kind that focused specifically on residential cooking electrification in low-income housing with tenants in place. And so our pilot focused on a New York City Housing Authority building in the Hunts Point neighborhood of the Bronx, which is a neighborhood that's known as Asthma Alley. It's surrounded on all three sides in like a triangle formation by highways. There's really high rates of asthma. And the residents of this building have been dealing with leaks, they've been dealing with mold, lead, a number of these environmental hazards that we mentioned. And so we recruited 20 apartments. 10 of those apartments we installed electric induction stoves. The other 10 kept their existing gas stove until the end of the pilot, when then we offered them their own induction stove. And we measured air quality throughout all 20 apartments over time, over about 10 months, to see how air quality improved when we had an electric stove versus a gas stove inside people's apartments. And we focused specifically on nitrogen dioxide because that is an air pollutant that can exacerbate or increase the likelihood of developing respiratory illnesses like asthma, and something that is very prevalent when you have a gas stove in a very tight, small New York City apartment. And so what did we find? And I know this isn't a conference about health, but I think this is important to highlight, is that just by removing the gas stove from these apartments, we saw a 35% reduction in daily nitrogen dioxide concentration, which is pretty impressive. We also were finding that gas stoves, that households with gas stoves had concentrations of nitrogen dioxide that were above what the EPA considers safe for outdoor exposure. We don't have indoor air quality standards, but if we did, I can assure you that these levels would be beyond what would be acceptable or safe. And I think just a little, side note, which is important, is that our participants, they ranged in age from 25 to 85. They came from all different backgrounds. Some of them were first-generation New Yorkers. Some of them were fourth-generation New Yorkers. The one aspect that was similar about everybody was that they loved their new induction stove. Everybody in our pilot had only cooked on a gas stove in their lives. Some of them had had the same gas stove in their apartment for 40 years. And they really welcomed this new technology and honestly adopted, transitioned to it very easily. We were impressed at how few questions we had when after we installed them. Our pilot was really small. This is a 96-unit building, and we installed 20 induction stoves. And we saw a number of challenges that are going to come up when we're thinking about electrifying buildings, particularly low-income housing, that has a lot of these structural deficiencies. So our building, as I mentioned, was a New York City Housing Authority building, and while that is kind of its own entity, it's, I think, representative or indicative of a lot of low-income housing across New York City and New York State and, frankly, the country. But there's going to be a number of significant investments that we need to put into these buildings just to reach the electrification starting line. We're frankly a far way off in many of these buildings. For example, in the New York City Housing Authority portfolio, they're the largest landlord in New York City. They manage almost 200,000 units. They have $40 billion of deferred maintenance right now across their portfolio. And this is, due to a number of factors, including, decreasing funding from the federal and state and city governments, but that is going to be a barrier to doing a lot of this electrification work. And we saw this in our building. We could only install 2 induction stoves per vertical line because the building didn't have the electrical capacity to handle more. There's also, as I mentioned, health and safety issues that are going to need to be resolved. This building was particularly impacted by Hurricane Ida. It had some major roof leaks, and that had led to some mold development. And so the Housing Authority recently got a grant to do some plumbing work in the building, which is desperately needed, but it's not going to be enough to cover a number of these other big infrastructural challenges. The other thing that we're noticing with especially state programs is that they are very siloed. They all take kind of a piece of the electrification puzzle, but what that does is it often leaves out older buildings that have complex or unique issues. And I'm, preaching to the choir here, but all buildings, they all have to need a different approach. And the programs just aren't designed to be flexible in that way. And then it is really important to note that New York City in particular it's a city of renters, and renters have very limited autonomy over decarbonization efforts. They have very limited access to these programs, even though they do have the most to gain from these improvements, which many of us know is the split incentive. But that is a very real problem if we're thinking about helping some of our most vulnerable populations. And so I just want to end this by talking about a promise that has been made by the governor of New York. In 2022, she announced in her State of the State a plan to electrify 2 million homes by 2030, with 40 of those homes being moderate to low income, which is a really great goal and a good promise, but to date we have seen no comprehensive plan to achieve this goal. And the problems that we've identified in our pilot are going unresolved. And so there's been a number of pushes, as Jessica said, the state budget is ongoing, and we're hoping to see some of these solutions included. But what we see from our side is when we're working with these state programs and electrification programs, we need more transparency on what programs are getting funded, but more importantly, what's not getting funded, because we need to understand what the fall off is or what the problems are that are not being addressed to prevent some of these weatherization, energy efficiency, electrification projects from moving forward. We also need to look long and hard at our cost-benefit analysis and make sure that it does prioritize health and safety as well. We talked to a number of contractors that work with NY-CERTA programs that said that they had to turn down projects for a number of reasons, but one of the big ones is that NY-CERTA's programs often will look at how much cost savings a project will bring through energy efficiency and doesn't consider the fact that removing lead from an apartment or remediating the mold in that apartment would have major health benefits, even if that doesn't necessarily save money in the immediate. And then we desperately need some sort of fund, and we like to call this the GAP fund, to help low-income housing do this electrification work, to fill these holes that exist when you're dealing with older buildings that have a lot of these structural, deferred maintenance, structural deficiencies, environmental hazards. And so we've been pushing for this GAP fund in the state budget, and it would, help cover some of these costs that are missing and fill some of these holes that exist. That's ultimately allowing a lot of these lower income older buildings to fall through the cracks. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie, and I'm sure folks are going to have lots of questions about that amazing pilot that you all did. Okay, we're going to switch a little bit gears here, and we're going to hear, so we've heard about the incentives, and we've heard about some of the ideas for how to address some of the things that the incentives don't cover now. But now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the gas system itself. Because when we're talking about electrifying, we're moving off of something, right? We're moving off of fossil fuels, and for a lot of people, that's going to be moving off of gas. And so we need to talk about, who pays for that system, how much is it going to cost, and how can we move some of that money over? So I'm going to hand it over to Lisa now, who's going to talk about kind of a mind-blowing study that they recently released that gets into some of these issues.
What's mine? This one?
Just press this to
Okay. Great. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Dix, and I am the New York Director of the Building Decarbonization Coalition. The Building Decarbonization Coalition is a newer organization in New York. We're about a year and a half old. We unite policymakers, building industry representatives, labor, environmental, climate justice, manufacturing stakeholders to work together to remove barriers, to rapidly advance and align policy and legislation, consumer education, and scale electrification and decarbonization of our homes, businesses, and workplaces. So we commissioned a report just about 6 months ago with groundwork data, and we really went into this inquiry looking at what does the gas system cost, right? And what is going to be the consequences of not doing anything, right? Business as usual. And how does that help us be able to have the conversations, the real conversations about costs in the gas planning dockets that are now, moving forward with the Public Service Commission, and the conversations that we need with the legislature, for what kinds of things need to happen to remove the barriers that need to get removed in the law so that we're able to facilitate and move forward a phased, managed, and equitable transition off the gas system. So the report is called The Future of Gas. And some of the key findings, I want to say that, the report, after we looked at the data and the numbers, and I want to say that the data was collected from the utilities' own data. And what this really, framed up for us is that this was a gigantic wake-up call. This is the first of its kind study, really looking at the avoided costs of what we can avoid if we're able to facilitate a phased and managed and equitable transition off the gas distribution system in New York, and what that looks like. So what we really realized from the study, on some of the key findings, we had like 12, I believe, but I'll just go through a few really top level, is that without intervention, utilities will continue to be allowed to prioritize their business interests over the public interest. The cost to New Yorkers will be astronomical. And I'll show you a couple of really great slides that really try to paint that picture. This is gonna cause an energy emergency, an energy cost emergency. And the good news is that if we act now and start to move some of these recommendations forward, we really can start to have these conversations that we need to have, and we can actually start planning right-sizing the gas distribution system in pretty short order. I also want to say that this is going to be a longer transition, right? This is going to, we've got goals up to 2050. So we've got time to really put the policies in place and to really figure out the solutions in a phased and managed way that are going to be able to get us to the place that we're going to need to get in the state of New York by 2050. So this, let's see, I'm running my own slides. This, oops, there we go, sorry, look at me. So basically, the report looked at 4 different scenarios, right? So we looked at, what are the costs and implications of continued reliance on pipeline gas? What are the costs and implications of unmanaged transition off pipeline gas? And this basically, what this means is this is kind of more of like a house by house approach, which quite frankly is the current policy in the state of New York at this point, because we haven't really figured out these neighborhood scale solutions and the zonal solutions that we think are going to be needed when we're looking at a gas system, transition. We looked at hybrid heating options. There's robust debate right now at the commission and politically in New York about, well, should we just keep the system the same, or shall we, put hydrogen in our gas pipes? Shall we put, shall we have RNG, renewable natural gas, as a bridge? And so we looked at those implications as well. And then we looked at the risks of, and the costs of a phased and managed transition. So this kind of gives you like a visual of what really, for those visual folks in the audience, this really gives like really, kind of what the outcome of the report came to, which is without state action, the costs for gas consumers are going to rise exponentially. And this shows that, what we're looking at here is, as we've got the costs that are being put into the existing structure. We've got, all of the climate policies that are in place right now. And then we've got, the competing technologies. And so what I really wanted to do here was talk about some of the major pieces that, some of the major costs that we're looking at with this visual. So what we found was that there has been an extraordinary amount of money since the climate law has passed that has continued to go into the gas system for gas maintenance. This is it's $6 million per mile. That equates to $60 million per customer when we're really thinking about it. We know that we're basically going to have to think about all of the competition that's going to be coming, right at our doorsteps. And Michael really talked about this. So this is competition. The New York State Energy and Research Development Authority estimated that there's going to be about $7 to $11 billion in IRA money coming to New York between now and 2040. Right? We've got clean heat incentives, we've got other kinds of incentives. And so the transition that is happening right now is that a lot of people are going to be leaving the gas system in a very unmanaged way, which then what happens and what the report showed is that as people leave the gas system, the costs for the people who are going to be remaining on the gas system are going to become exponentially high. And so this next slide really kind of really drills down on that. So we have targets in the state of New York, and under the Climate Action Council scoping plan, what is going to need to happen by 2040 is that, we need 85% of people in New York to be off the gas system, right? That's the projection, just to give you a perspective. So this shows that by 2050, if 50% of the people in New York that are currently on the gas system leave the gas system because they've taken advantage of all of these other incentives, right? And they're just doing their electrification on their own, their bill is going to their bill will be $1,500. And this is just for the system charge. That is not even for the fuel costs. When we're looking at 75%, look, we've got a $3,000 utility bill, just to kind of, bring this home for what's going to be the customer impact. And when we've got a 90%, remember, we need 85%. If we don't do this in a phased way, we've got a nearly $8,000 utility bill. So this is really something that we've got to get our heads around in New York. And fortunately, right now we have. I'm sorry about my slides. That I'm like such. So the recommendations that are really coming out of this is really important. Number one is that right now in the New York State Legislature, there is a bill called New York HEET that many organizations, including my own, are working very vigorously to get over the finish line this session. And what this bill does is it basically really aligns climate law with public service law. Because right now the utilities, they are obligated under the law to connect any customer that wants to be to the gas system, right? And that is completely out of line. And so this legislation would work to eliminate that obligation, to eliminate the subsidies that go along with that, because right now also people who want to get connected to the gas system, and if they're 100 feet away from this gas system, get an additional subsidy, which is an additional cost to all gas ratepayers of around anywhere from $200 to $300 million a year. Right? So that's another additional cost that we're all absorbing, or all the gas customers are absorbing in the state of New York. And this is the one step that would eliminate that subsidy. And then it will put a 6% cap on energy bills, which, as we've just heard from Annie, is going to be really important to making this transition equitable. And that will also help us defray these rising costs of maintaining the gas, simply maintaining the gas system. We also have a few other recommendations, which is that we ask the PSC to adopt an overarching gas planning framework, that they clarify the true costs of RNG and hydrogen and their proposals in front of the commission now for that, and that they submit those costs transparently. The PSC steers the development of the climate law pathway studies, and that DC is going to establish medium and long-term sector-specific targets so that we can really start to bring and ratchet down those emissions over time. All of those things need to work together. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jessica.
Okay, I feel like I felt the anxiety about all these costs rising in the room as Lisa was going. Don't worry. Our next speaker is going to talk about how can we avoid this and repurpose some of this horrible rising costs of the gas system over to our solutions. So, Audrey.
Thanks. So I guess I have the easy part of this presentation, right? So just to give a very fast visual version of what Lisa did, pretend this is first I'll explain the problems currently, and then I'll go into the potential solutions, right? So this is the visual version of what Lisa presented. Here's the gas system. As gas customers transition from gas to air source heat pumps, the system is not getting any smaller, right? It's not getting any less expensive. So the remaining customers are paying for more and more of the cost of the infrastructure, and that's why you get that rising energy bill over time. And at some point, there's going to be an inflection point hit where heating with gas is going to become more expensive than heating with air source heat pumps. At that point, everybody's going to want to get off the system. The only people left will be those who cannot, because they're renters or they're low income. The Germans call this, I believe it's the Germans, call this the last grandmother problem, where there's going to be, just imagine, one last grandma on the entire Con Ed natural gas system, paying for the entire system. That's not doable, right? And then there's the problem also with the electric system. Here is our annual or seasonal electric grid peaks, right, for the entire country. So that little bump up in the center is when we all turn our air conditioners on in the middle of the summer. What happens when we take all of our buildings and move them to electricity? Well, it depends on what method we use, right? So at the top, you see what would happen if we took all of our buildings and moved them to electric baseboard, which, of course, we would never do, right? But if we did, you can see that the electric peaks now look something like a falcon flying at you, right? And the falcon, of course, for those of you who are wonks, is way scarier than the duck. And then next down, we've got the air source heat pump option. And that falcon's beginning to land, right? Its wings are going down. At the bottom, and so this is based on efficiency, right? Ground source heat pumps are more efficient than air source because the temperature in the ground is always consistent. So therefore, that would be more efficient. We'd be reducing our impact on the electric grid. And that's incredibly important, both because the peaks on the electric grid are disproportionately expensive. They're when we turn on the most expensive, dirtiest emissions, the worst power plants. So the more efficient we go overall with our building electrification, the more quickly we can go, because we don't have to source as much renewables or as much battery storage, right? And the less expensive our electric rates will be. So here's the COP, the efficiency of networked geothermal. We've now flattened the falcon curve, and we've actually even raised what's called the load factor for the electric grid. This means money for the electric grid. So the question is, will the electric utilities potentially throw some money in for this transition? Because they are becoming more profitable this way. There's actually a co-op in Oklahoma where they install single building installations of geothermal, ground source heat pumps, and they pay for those installations using this increased load factor. Also, with networked geothermal, the overall geothermal bill, or ground source heat pump bill, right, will be lower than that of gas, according to an economic prediction we did with Applied Economics Clinic. And this was using Massachusetts data, and it's making the assumption that the gas utility is transitioning from gas to networked geothermal. And they are amortizing that cost across all gas customers and all geothermal customers in a single merged rate base over decades, as they do their gas infrastructure now. If so, because our current gas bill is about 50% fuel, and the rest is for, the remaining 50% is for operations, maintenance, and installation, then we're taking away that fuel cost. And so that's why this, we're just replacing it with a minimal amount of electricity, because the system is so incredibly efficient. And so that's how they come up with this prediction. And of course, they are not regulators, Applied Economics Clinic. So we cannot promise this, but this looks good. So what would happen if we do that? If we merge that gas and geo rate base into a single merged rate base where all customers are paying for both infrastructures? Well, entire streets can transition at the same time. And that's keeping that customer to infrastructure ratio the same, right? They're still part of the same system. And that way we can transition without increasing that energy burden, that energy bill for the remaining gas customers, because this is all still the same pool of customers. And then we can also do zonal electrification, which in this case means transitioning some customers on streets where it's not financially viable to do networked geothermal, transition them to air source heat pumps. Use the avoided costs from that gas infrastructure system. For instance, let's assume that street was leak-prone infrastructure, gas infrastructure. Take that money that you would have spent on replacing that gas pipe and just pay the customers to transition off the system, hand them over to the local electric utility. And then finally, just to throw in one fun idea, you can also stage this with using now what are called multi-source heat pumps, which are heat pumps that can both go air source and geo. And so what you can do then is you go down the street, say that street, that last remaining street, it's leak-prone infrastructure. It's an old gas pipe, has to be replaced. You know it's going to be replaced in, say, 10 years. You go down the street, you ask every customer, hey, how old's your heating system? Is it close to end of life? Well, how about I replace your heating system with an air source heat pump? And I do the retrofit in your building, and I maintain you as a customer. And then do that for every building on the street where their heating system is old and about to die. You give them the system for very low cost or maybe free, and you maintain that customer. And then you can do the whole street when it's time to replace the infrastructure. And you replace it with networked geothermal. That's a way to keep that customer base overall. So I'm hoping that there'll be a combination of electric utilities paying for the customer transition, because they're going to get that increased load factor. I hope that the gas utilities are going to be paying some, because it's the only way their business is going to continue in this new decarbonized future. And then finally, just echoing off of what Michael had said earlier, I hope that some of the utilities, or maybe the states, take a large chunk of funding through the Inflation Reduction Act, and that comes through the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office. It's very low interest rate, much lower than the gas utilities can currently get. And the states give it to the gas utilities to do this sort of work, with the stipulation, the mandate, that those utilities use the cost savings to do those customer retrofits. So those are three potential ideas which would allow utilities and all of us to transition equitably to a lower cost system that would be safer, have improved indoor air quality, and could be the kind of future we all want. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Matt is gonna bring the mic around. Because we have so little time for questions, I'm just gonna ask you. 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to keep your questions brief. Try not to pontificate too much and get to the question. Go ahead. Let's start in the front and move our way.
Be nice. I know I will be nice. To these people, I will be certainly nice. No, thank you very much. That's one thing. The other, for your fantastic work and effort and belief in geothermal. I'm from New York Geothermal, from New York City. Now, I would like to just add one more incentive for you to think about and hopefully to promote.
Do you have a question?
Yes, the question is, I mean, it's actually more of a comment, but okay, I'll turn it into a question. Would you please include into your, incentive structure or a promotion program this idea of doing the same what they do in Germany, Switzerland, anywhere in Europe, pretty much in Asia as well. So they allow the sidewalks and the roads to be used by the geothermal as of right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm nice, right?
That was great.
I am going to ask
Great.
people to please keep their comments to questions, so that we can take advantage of this great expertise that we have here. But does anybody have a quick answer on the use of the rights of way for good idea? Okay. Let's go here.
Thank you. Manisha Rani Fondakaro, Solar Solutions LLC. Just as we have individual homes, they have rooftop solar. What if individual apartments were to have their own electricity generation? Would that help with this transition? Thank you.
Does anybody want to answer that?
Live.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody should have generation. The problem, of course, is what that generation is. And this, networked geothermal would be one way of reducing the need for that generation and also producing renewable thermal, clearly. And it also is a way of balancing off the problem of intermittent renewables, such as wind and solar. So, yes. Anybody else want to add?
I'll just say that under the IRA, there are tax credits available for the installation of rooftop solar. It's a 30% uncapped tax credit for rooftop solar, battery storage, and geothermal heating. And that's available now up from January 2023. And I think for the rooftop solar, you could also use it if you installed in 2022. So that's a 30% tax credit that's available under the IRA.
Okay, we're going to go to someone in the back. Who in the back wants to speak?
You're in charge. Ron? Yes. All right. Question.
Yes, thank you. Two questions. One to Audrey and one to Annie, please. Oh.
Just to be able to share around for people.
Okay. So to Audrey. So Audrey, could you talk about some of the pilot projects that you guys are doing with the gas industry and what's that looking like and how is that transition happening both in your sector of the world and elsewhere where you're working, please?
Yeah, great question, and I did not pay you to ask that question. So in Massachusetts, the Eversource Gas is currently, has already installed the test boreholes, and they will have a system live in Framingham, Massachusetts by the end of the year. The installation will include a firehouse, a school, a part of a school, some businesses, over 40 different multi-unit and single-unit homes. National Grid has picked its first site in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I'm thrilled about the site. That will be, I'm not quite sure how many. I think it's got University of Lowell part of that on it, as well as a variety of homes and residents on it. There's a whole bunch of installations, as you all know, happening in New York, or pilots suggested, which I would never, I think other people here are more able
Yeah, I
to
was
discuss.
going to actually just have you hand it over to Lisa, because there are amazing pilots also happening in New York, in case you're not aware.
So last session, at the very end of the session, last day, in fact, the Utility Thermal Energy Network and Jobs Act passed. And what this is it's really trying to establish, it's trying to do two things. It's really trying to test thermal energy networks, or as Audrey calls it, network geothermal, same thing. And really kind of tests and really try to have the utilities be able to test different financing structures, all kinds of different ideas, right? And it's not just like geothermal, it's, deep boreholes, waste heat, all different kinds of ways in which to design these networks. So right now, we have 15 active pilots in the docket. The docket was opened earlier this year, and we're now just working through those. And the idea is that some of these projects are going to move forward. The utilities have up to 5 pilots each to be able to do. And that's the 7 investor-owned utilities in the state of New York, the gas utilities. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, we have time for at least one more question. Who else do we have? Okay.
Thank you. Bob Fishman, Sustainable Promise. Looking at the slide up here, and we're thinking about the transition from gas infrastructure to, say, geothermal infrastructure, or perhaps even running hydrogen through existing lines. The financing of these gas pipelines is generally done through long-term bonds, tenors of 30, 40 years or longer, perhaps. And I wonder how the analysis has accounted for the investment that's already in place and the timing of that transition, for accounting for those long-term loans and or long-term bonds and that are in place, and those that are going to be through the transition process. Thank you.
Yeah, try again. Sorry. So that idea that the applied economics clinic analysis was based on the idea that the system would be amortized in its conventional way with the long-term loans, the 50% debt, 50% equity, roughly. In the very, very conventional way. With the gas, there's a lot of gas infrastructure that is not yet paid off and will not be paid off by 2050. And so with that infrastructure, it will either have to have accelerated depreciation, accelerated payback, so that it's all paid back by 2050, or there's probably going to be big problems of other kinds. But our hope is by the fact that GEO energy bill, the GEO heating bill, should be lower. It's possible that some of that accelerated depreciation can be paid off by the GEO savings. Fingers crossed. And if there's any economic experts in the room, we so need your help to look, to delve into this deeper and more strongly in every possible way, so we know that it'll work.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
So can I just add to that, though? In Massachusetts, the estimate was that it's going to cost anywhere between $20 and $40 billion to replace those pipes because they're so leak prone. So part of the financial equation is that you use that $20 to $40 billion of the next 20 years. Instead, you use it for network geothermal. And I think that's very similar to what the New York study found, which is that pipe that needs to be replaced it's really expensive. So if instead of spending it on more gas pipe, you could spend it on network geothermal, it would be really incredible.
Yeah,
Okay,
just the number for New York is $28 billion by 2043 is just for the existing system, to maintain the existing system.
All right, one final question. Make it a good one. No pressure.
Has to be good. Just tease it.
So through doing a lot of outreach work, I know we're all in different fields. I commonly get the question of, the statement, our electric grid is not like made for this or can't handle this. So do you have either a resource you could direct us educators to, or even contractors who are trying to help folks get onto heat pumps, or have like 2 really good comeback responses to help with that?
I was going to give it to Michael.
Okay, I was just going to talk about the projects. Go ahead.
So ReWiring America did a report recently in regards to looking at the All Electric Buildings Act, which would electrify new construction in New York State, to kind of look at those numbers. If you look at the projections in the summer of 2022, the NY-GEO basically provided that there was approximately 42 gigawatts of capacity, and that our peak demand was 31 gigawatts of capacity during the summer. And so there's an overhead between those two numbers of 10 gigawatts of power. New York State has about 6 gigawatts of installed reserve, and so then there's an additional 4 gigawatts of overhead. And 1 megawatt will power approximately 1,000 homes. So there's a tremendous amount of overhead for making the transition, the electrification transition.
Lisa, you want to add anything? Okay.
Just for a resource, Urban Green did an analysis, and so it's on their website. It really shows that there is like 10 years of headroom on the grid, the electric grid, and that's Urban Green. I also want to just point out that the state actually does have a pathway. We're going to be bringing on 9 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2035 downstate. That's offshore wind. We've got at least 9 gigawatts of projects in the pipeline. I think like 7 or 8 of them, large-scale sun and wind, have just moved forward. So there is a pathway to get to 100% renewable grid in New York by 2040, and we're really on that pathway. So as you know, I also want to point out one other fact, that new construction, the electrification of new construction, what we're learning is like outside of New York City, we're looking at, and this is by 2025, 2026, we're looking at about 2,000 new homes, right? So I just want to try to keep that in perspective with all of the clean energy coming on at scale, that we do have the policies in place and the headroom on the grid to electrify now at scale. So.
Okay, we're at time. Thank you, Lisa, for the last word. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists.